how should schools be leveraging that stuff in a legally compliant way where we're avoiding things like copyright concerns and, thinking about what that can mean to the benefit of schools.
Wait, so are
While
there
also,
copyright concerns with ChatGPT?
yeah, I mean, isn't this fascinating?
We are surrounded by content. Content shapes who we follow, how we lead, what we buy, and even what we believe. Welcome to the Content Generation Podcast, a class intercom production where we focus on the stories that come to life in schools all over the world. We highlight the students, educators, and communities who share the content that shapes our future. Well, welcome to the Content Generation Podcast. Jill, this was a fun segment, as fun as it can be to talk with an attorney.
They're the best. He's the best, yeah.
Honestly, Bobby's one of my favorite attorneys. We had a great conversation about school law, and you've got some personal connections to Bobby.
Well, definitely. Bobby and Karen, their whole team, they're some of the most fun and yet experts in their area that I know. And so I loved working with Bobby when they were our school lawyers, when I was a high school administrator, but also Bobby's wife was one of my students when I taught at Milford High School. So shout out to Chrissy, one of my favorites. She was fantastic.
We had a great conversation about a lot of different areas, including some conversations about emerging law around AI. We had some great chats. I wish I probably should have kept it recording because Bobby and I ended up having a lot of conversation after the podcast this morning as well. So it was really great getting to catch up with a lot of what he's seeing. But one of the things, Jill, that is concerning that we talked about at the beginning is the just emerging need for more and more law in our field of communications.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it can be really scary. It's why we want to stay informed and keep people like Bobby on our speed dial, right? Because they're, as much as it's moving so quickly and changing so quickly, they're staying on top of that too. So you don't have to do it alone, and it's why you want to reach out to the experts.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited to get to the podcast and get you all to get a chance to meet Bobby. Well, welcome to the Content Generation Podcast. Bobby, it is so good to be with you. We've had you on some webinars and get to run into you at conferences and hear a lot of what you're doing as a school attorney for many different districts, not just around this area, but really, across the country. I know you're working with a lot of different conversations, questions, around the country as it pertains to school law. Bobby, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ben. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk about some of what I'm seeing out there and this work that I love to do and know is beneficial and appreciative of all your listeners and what they do for kids. So let's do it.
Well, Bobby, it's exciting to see the work that you're doing, and I love the approach that you and Karen and the rest of the team have to really understanding and helping empower schools and school districts to really understand where they're at and really be an expert in that field. How did you get started into school law? How did that happen?
Well, I kind of lucked into it, to be honest with you. I started right after my first year of law school with a firm that practiced education law, school law. And so it was one of those where, you'd get various projects from around the office from people that did different things. You had kind of estate planning, wills and trusts, and then you had criminal law and you had family law and you had, corporate law. And the folks that always seemed to have the most fun, you could tell were totally vibing with their clients the best, that enjoyed the work that they did. And that was the school law folks. So I just gravitated toward it a bit like a moth to a flame because I decided pretty early on that, I want to be a lawyer, but I also want the work that I do to be meaningful and to be something that I care about beyond, the transaction of it. So I got into school law, have never done anything else other than education law. I've dabbled here and there early in my career, but my focus for probably about the last 10 years has been nothing other than education law. And then when we formed our firm, we literally set it up. We're KSB School Law because that's all we wanted to do. And I'm not sure how much of us would be lawyers, candidly, if we didn't do education law, just because you get to work with great people, you kind of have a North Star. And I think the things that folks ask us to help with, we get to feel like it makes a difference. Because there's a lot of it's not like it's a narrow area of law, it's everything, but how it applies to a school. So it's always something new every day. None of your listeners, of course, will have any disagreement with that. So I got into it kind of by luck, but also because it was just so obvious to me the type of client you get to work with and the type of stuff you get to do was going to be meaningful.
That's awesome. So as you've kind of progressed through this field of law, we've sort of caught up, from time to time. And, I think about where things were at in COVID was certainly a tough time where you were dealing with a lot of things. We sort of chatted about that. But, now that things have changed a little bit, we'll say loosened up. I think CDC says we're out of a pandemic, but how have you seen that change the type of work you're seeing in schools as of late?
Yeah, it's fascinating. We talk about it a lot. What I would say is in schools now, the types of disagreements, the frequency of those disagreements, the straight impasse point where we're just never going to find common ground no matter how hard we try, where people believe one thing so deeply that they're never going to be moved off of that. There's no explanation a school can give that's going to convince them that what the school is thinking about or doing is potentially the right thing, or maybe has to comply with the law. And so the disputes are just, if you would have a handful of disputes that were at a 10, every school year dating back to, probably when people started doing this kind of work, you have, I don't know, 5 times, 10 times that many,
Wow.
where you just, the disagreements, and I don't care if that's, between parents of the school and, or parents of a student and the school about services their child's going to receive, about a discipline issue, whether my child should be the starting center on the basketball team or not. Did my child make National Honor Society? We've always had those things, Ben. It's not new, the stuff, right? The substance necessarily, but the level of difficulty in some of those situations and how frequently they happen, just a huge uptick. I think the reason that I tie that a bit to the pandemic is there were some straight yes or no, black, white type of issues in terms of, should a school have a mask mandate or not? You'd have schools saying, we're required by law to do it. I don't know what you want us to do. And folks saying, well, masks don't work. And I think it was just the divisiveness of some of those issues that has not subsided, even if the number of COVID cases and the sort of restrictions and, modifications schools have had to make have gone down. I just think that over that period of time, based on what was happening in national politics, local health level decisions, those just vehement, total impasse type of moments, those just seem to have stuck around.
So as you think about how you educate your clients who are in that day to day from a communications and administration perspective, what do you tell them? Like, how do you be prepared for that? How do you handle an environment at which legal responsibilities are certainly escalated?
It's been made more difficult. I have never, more so than the last couple of years, appreciated the fact that public trust in their local public school has always been so important, because trying to explain to a group of individuals who just do not understand why that third grader that tears apart the classroom, that has a disability, that has special education needs, why would we educate that student? And I'm not talking, Ben, that you're just hearing that sort of stuff from, people in a community. That's people in state governments that simply don't understand the complexities of the laws that schools tackle every single day, that don't have an appreciation for maybe what's just beyond their bubble, that there may be other families out there going through things that are difficult, that may have obligations for the school. And those other folks might have strong feelings the exact same way on the opposite side. And so I think a lot of it has been, legal advice, sure, there's some things we just have to do. And if the answer is, I'm sorry, we have to do it, that just is what it is. It's dealing with maybe how that message is delivered, what we can do to better educate, maybe even your own staff members who are some of the best, people to help. I'm going to say the word defend the school and what it's doing, because that's kind of what it feels like at this point, like where you got to defend yourself because you're complying with the law. And that just is where we are in 2023. And so I think it's working with schools on not only, okay, here's what the law says, but how are we going to deliver that message? What conversations are we going to have that maybe we didn't have 5 years ago, even with some of the stakeholders in the building, outside of the building? How are we going to start rebuilding that trust? Demonstrating to people the awesome things that we're doing in this school instead of, talking about it as a reactionary thing. How do we celebrate our success story? Look at this cool, inclusive thing that we did. And making sure that what doesn't get lost in all the difficult fights is the awesome stuff that schools are doing and how they're still, just an institutional pillar for all the other problems we face in society. And so I think it's a combo, really, right? We always joke in the profession, you're an attorney and counselor at law. Yeah. They added the and counselor for some reason. I'm certainly no, mental health professional or communications, PR type of expert. But so much of what happens in school now requires a discussion, oftentimes with a lawyer, about how are we going to implement that? How are we going to deliver that? It's not just the decision. It's then, how is this going to be, what reaction are we going to get among other students, among parents, among our community? And just thinking through some of that stuff where the ability to express your thoughts about a school has never been easier. If you run a school Facebook page, you got people on there telling you what they think in 5 minutes versus walking into the principal's office and really desiring an understanding of what's happening. So much of what I do now and what everybody does that practices this type of law is given the legal advice, but then talking through what is that going to mean? And we have always done that, but never has it been more important. 90% of the stuff takes up, 10% of the stuff takes up 90% of the time. And more frequently, that has been based in, we got to do this to comply with the law. Now, how are we going to make sure that doesn't create 75 people at the board meeting, 150 comments on the Facebook page? It's just talking through all that more so than ever. And I find that stuff to be where I think schools always do their best. There's a component of it that's legal. There's a component of it that's just got to use your good judgment. There's a component of it that is, schools becoming their own PR firms, basically, through some of this stuff. And some of that's just straight for conflict avoidance. And so it's really the marrying together of all those things, not thinking of them in a silo, like here's the legal advice. Now we hang up with the lawyer and we go over and figure out, okay, we're going to talk to the staff. Here's what we're going to do. Like, you got to think of it comprehensively. So that's been a unique challenge to deal with from my seat, is figuring out how to anticipate to some extent, but also then knowing how are we going to react if we get the reaction that we expect we'll get.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I've really appreciated about you and your firm is the way that you've been proactive about communicating with the school, right? So doing the trainings that you do, and then also you do trainings not just for the school and the personnel there, but also for students and parents. Can you describe a little bit of how that works? I know some of it's surrounding digital citizenship and how students have legal rights and maybe aren't aware of some of the things that they're doing too.
You name a type of training that you could think about, or a type of presentation in a context, and we've probably done it. And so we do what I would consider, what any school staffer or school attorney would consider standard types of training. You have to have training on the disability related laws, on Title IX. We do a lot of that stuff. That's still, the training required by law, still absolutely a big part of what we do. What we realized many years ago is, in some cases, and especially in some communities, there might not be other resources out there to talk about some of the issues that schools are dealing with that absolutely have a legal component to them, to varying degrees, whether it's, a strict legal question versus for lack of a better way, best practices question, or how do we handle this at a practical level type of stuff. And so we started doing training, picked up and did a lot more in-services for staff. For example, I know one of the things that we've collaborated with you on before is just how does the First Amendment, interact with the things that students and staff members are doing online. And so we'll talk to staff members about that. We'll go out and give training for students on digital citizenship. This is what the law actually says. This is the stuff that you would see if you looked at your student handbook but never really thought about. These are some of the examples out there from cases where students have had to face the consequences of inappropriate, sometimes criminal use of social media. We talk about bullying. We talk about harassment. We talk about, appropriate and inappropriate content online. And we've done some of that for parents too. And without fail, right, every school that I've been at that doesn't have a great parent turnout is like, man, I wish more parents could get this stuff. We agree. And so it's kind of knowing the problems that schools face because we get calls on the back end of that, right? How do we handle the discipline? How can we be proactive in talking to staff about how they should respond if they see or hear about that stuff happening online? Training for administrators, training for staff, training for students, education for students and parents on what the law actually says. Why is your school responding this way when your kid's doing stuff on Snapchat that you have no idea they're doing at 11 o'clock? Well, here's kind of why. So it really, I think, born of a need that existed out there, but more than anything, just because you can't unravel the legal implications for the families, for the school, for law enforcement, for everybody else in that discussion.
Yeah, as we think of First Amendment concerns as content creators, right? We have to be aware of some of those. Do you have some basics that we should be thinking of as we think about First Amendment, and then also what students' rights are?
Yeah, so it's always interesting when you think. I kind of tend to put them in buckets. There's obviously a lot more overlap than you might think, but I think the First Amendment just hits different, as the kids say, when you're talking about the rights of students who are in most states mandatory attendees at your school, right? So if they're in a public school, if they're not doing homeschooling or attending a private school, if they're in a public school, that's a state actor. So those students' First Amendment rights are protected a little differently. They have to be there. And so to exclude a student from school obviously implicates, whatever state discipline laws you have, but their First Amendment rights, there's a pretty good argument that maybe outside of community members and patrons in your community, students have stronger First Amendment rights in a school setting than staff do. That's not something that's easily or well understood, but I think of sort of the student First Amendment rights as the way the Supreme Court's weighed in on that issue. We're talking a lot more about, especially with the increase in social media, where did it happen? What is the misconduct you're talking about when a student misuses social media? Did it happen at home and then it's causing a problem at school? Did it happen at school and now it's causing a problem in school and out of school? The location matters, right? Is it threatening or is it just mean? Could it be bullying or harassment? Is that treated differently than students beefing over, who they think the next president should be? So it gets relatively complicated for students. For staff members, maybe a little bit easier to the extent that when you're in school on duty, you really aren't exercising in a K-12 setting, right? Traditional, U.S. First Amendment rights. But then you throw in, school social media presence and parents and patrons that you may have somebody from out of state commenting on the stuff that you're doing. And how do we respect the rights that they have under the First Amendment versus making sure that the content that we not only put out, but are also receiving comments on is regulated in a way that we think is not only appropriate for our educational setting, but understanding they still got First Amendment rights too. For us to stop somebody from speaking, especially as a public school, that's a First Amendment event almost every time. So the extent to which we can regulate, try to prevent, but then also prohibit or delete or discipline for stuff that we think is inappropriate, man, it really is context and who the speaker was and location. And it just becomes kind of this, big, all right, let's throw all the factors on the table and let's talk it through type of thing.
Yeah. So anytime I hide, delete, or take any of those actions, I've got to have that lens that you're educating to. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fantastic way to be thinking about it. One of the other things I think about is like when you think about as school communications representatives, how do I communicate to parents in the community some of the things that I would like them to be more educated on law, right? Like there's the whole meme of like, do they want to learn math? Maybe they don't want to learn legal principles, but I do want to help them understand some legal principles, and how we're doing those things. How do I do that?
Yeah, well, I think first and foremost, this is going to sound a little bit self-serving and obvious, but getting yourself up to speed on that, right? Even just using the right terminology, talking about that stuff the right way, I think goes a long way, because really what you're hedging against to some extent is making that communication and that parent within seconds being able to Google it and cross-check whether you're actually, whether that can't be right. Or so I think part of our training is just making sure we're using the right terminology, making sure that when schools are communicating things, it is as clear and as simple as we can make it, right? Every policy that we write, we try to write at about a fifth grade level. It's a lot harder to write clearly and to write concisely than it is the opposite. So I think people know, right? When you're giving them some sort of blame the law, or here's what 34 CFR, blah blah blah. I don't think that works, but I think you have to understand that in order to boil it down to the layperson. When you are a school communications person, you are doing a lot of what a lawyer does, whether you're thinking about it that way or not. You're taking complex stuff and you're trying to boil it down into a way that gets your message across, that can be cross-checked, that can be verified by people who are out there using the Google machine because they're just convinced that you can't possibly be right about some of that stuff. And so I think getting up to speed, but then also making sure that there's some consistency in that communication. I think, there's a difference between when it's a crisis situation versus when it's not. I think tone should reflect that. I think folks that are sharing that type of stuff have to be mindful of their limitations, FERPA, confidentiality rules that may apply to staff in a given state. But by and large, to me, if the schools thinks, hey, this is something that we want to get out there, to community members, I certainly wouldn't hesitate if I'm a school, communication specialist, to simply run it by the lawyer, have them take a look at it, at least at first on some of that stuff. I mean, the amount of times that we are asked to help with what can we say in this type of statement, thankfully, we deal with that stuff every day, right? And it is something that I think your school lawyer can help you, especially if they understand what you're trying to do. And we really try to do that in my firm. So yeah, that's a kind of a meandering answer, Ben, but I think there's you as the communications person are doing a lot of what a school lawyer does, which is taking complex stuff and trying to get it out there in a meaningful way. Being proactive about that, I think, is awesome. I think schools should be celebrating the great stuff that they're doing. I think schools should not shy away from talking about things that are difficult. And to the extent that that's happening, at least making sure we're talking about it the right way. I think that is the most impactful way that I've seen, especially when you're talking about the context of complex laws and how we're going to get information out there about what we're doing and how we're doing it.
Yeah, when I think of what I want from my school district, right? Like I want them to be communicating to me clearly as a citizen, right? I also want them to be doing the right thing, and so you use the word trust a lot, which is something I love to use in presentations, and it's something that I think is really at the heart of what we want to be able to communicate. How do you do that in a way that you're communicating that legal principle, but doing it in a way that builds trust, right? Like anytime I get that 5-page legal document slid across the table, and now I've got to like sign that thing, whether I'm at the bank or somewhere else, that doesn't feel like a lot of trust. But what you're talking about is something fundamentally different, it seems like.
I think so, because any communication about bespoke legal advice between a school and their lawyer, that's protected by attorney-client privilege, right? There are often times when I think a school would love to be able to say, look at this 10-page document we got from the lawyers on what we thought was going to be a simple question, just to sort of like defense of themselves. And I understand that instinct to my bones, because it's like, look, this took 10 pages to answer this question, but now you're sitting in my office, or you're reading the school's, post, trying to decide if what we're doing is right. And where is right when so much of this is gray. So I think those schools that do a good job of proactively communicating, especially those areas that they know could be contentious, then when we're putting out information when it is contentious, you hope that people view you as the source. That's oftentimes the problem with when a school communicates only on a crisis selective basis, is because it looks to most people like what you're saying is you're kind of defensive. Like
Right.
if your community isn't hearing from you until you know a bunch of them are pissed, that's going to look defensive by its nature. So if we have been frequently communicating and talking about some of those things that we know are problematic when they're not in crisis mode, right? Like I had a school that I was talking to recently that tweeted out something about their threat assessment team getting training. And I just thought to myself, that is genius. Because when we get a threat of a student that says, I'm going to bring a gun to school, right? That immediately throws, I don't care which community you're in, right? I don't care if you're in LA or if you're in, Thedford, Nebraska. When that situation happens in your community, that's going to be a big deal. If people in your community kind of know and understand the process that you go through, the folks that are going to be involved, even if they hate your principal with a white hot hate, knowing that all these other folks are coming to the table, law enforcement's involved, and understanding before that moment happens that the school has a plan for this. We've talked about it. We train on some of this stuff. We have a good way to, sort out what's real from what's not. It just struck me as like, what a cool thing to send out there before we have the crisis moment, so that at least a decent number of your stakeholders in your community understand that exists in the first place. Because if you're sending out your first communication saying, and we convene the crisis team or the threat assessment team, and we, notified local law, like that's going to seem like you should send that kind of message out. Absolutely. But what a cool thing to have the community members, and especially parents and students, know that this stuff happens, right? When they view you as the place to go because they know that you've got a plan you're running.
Yeah.
Them knowing that before you send out your message is a lot different than trying to explain your plan and then explain the message when it's just going to seem kind of defensive.
Yeah, I love the way you're thinking about that being proactive. You referenced the Google machine and looking for things in that space. That's actually changed here in the last few months, because now I've used, I'll admit it, I've used ChatGPT to go do some legal research for me. Can it find some cases that pertain to, certain issues, whether that be Title IX or something else? And, can it help me do some of that research? How are you using AI, and what sort of legal implications are you finding in policy for school districts?
It's fascinating, right? Because what we are trying to do is to anticipate that the law is 10 to 20 years behind technology usually, right? I mean, you got states that are out there right now still talking about passing a requirement in their various state to teach students about good digital citizenship. When we've had a generation and a half of students that have been whatever type of digital citizen they're going to be. And now, you got people in the in whatever legislature you have. In Nebraska here, we've got a unicameral that are talking about things like, technology education. And I just find myself thinking we're about 20 years too late, really. And so what we're trying to anticipate, especially with things like AI and ChatGPT, number one, how do we leverage those? And how should schools be leveraging that stuff in a legally compliant way, where we're avoiding things like copyright concerns and, thinking about what that can mean to the benefit of schools.
Wait, so are there copyright concerns with ChatGPT?
Yeah, I mean, isn't this fascinating? I think ChatGPT would, if you told ChatGPT, I want you to kick out a lesson plan based on this book, I think ChatGPT could kick that out for you at this point.
Yeah.
And based on some of the stuff I've seen, I think at a minimum, even if you're just using it for idea creation versus document creation, there's some super cool stuff that it can do, different than straight going to the Google machine and finding something else, some other lesson plan that somebody else posted about the grapes of wrath, right? I mean, we're going another layer or 7 deeper than that with things like AI and kind of what it's generating for you to consider. So I think there's certainly copyright considerations because, any AI generated response is only as good as the inputs. And I'm going to sound a bit like a Luddite talking about this because I don't understand it as well as I should yet, Ben, not as well as you especially. But I think some of the copyright concerns come with, to me, not just making sure we didn't pull from someplace we couldn't and then use that and pass it off as our own, but then also interesting questions about who owns it once it's created. I had a school, and this I think will resonate with your folks that do, that are in a school. Every school has, disability education responsibilities for students with disabilities. They had a student they were really struggling with. They were figuring out how are we, so if I think a third or fourth grade student, we're struggling with coming up with ideas for how to address these behavior concerns we have. And one of the things in the law school may be required to create is a behavior intervention plan. They put the inputs into ChatGPT and it kicked out a document that I love and respect deeply, all the clients that I work with, but was better in 10 seconds than some of the stuff that I've seen kicked out when teams are really struggling in 3 hours of discussion and trying to write it down when you're in a stressful situation. So now who owns that? Is that some sort of specific, thing now that because the school was the first one to put those exact, modifying terms in and that kicked that out and they're going to use that as a template even if they modify it? Is that a copyrightable event? The school then printing that out and taking it, like if another school says, hey, can we have a copy? Is that giving away your school's, intellectual property? So in addition to some of that stuff that, of course, is fascinating for lawyers, and maybe we'll get an answer for it, by 2040 from the U.S. Supreme Court,
right.
That stuff is real and it's real today. And I also think of the other side of that. You got deep fakes, you got, some of the other things that schools are dealing with out there on the other side, not copyright. But it's a little bit to me like when we were telling administrators in the early, mid 2000s, you need to get on social media. Because if your students are using it, you need to understand it. Unless and until your school, and especially your administrators and communication folks, just simply bite the bullet and agree this is something I'm going to have to embrace, even if I feel like it's teaching an old dog new tricks. How are we going to understand the academic dishonesty implications and the copyright implications unless we know what's happening with it? And so it's starting to feel to me a little bit, Ben, like, how's a school going to leverage social media in 2008? It's starting to feel to me a bit that way. And I'm viewing it sort of similarly, but to me, it has even more far reaching implications for how it could improve education, improve legal compliance, and, be a tool, right? I think if we consider it a feature instead of a bug, we're just going to be better ahead, whether that's anticipating it being used inappropriately or figuring out how we can use it to better serve students.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And I like the way you sort of angled folks to saying like there is a certain amount of research or information that they could be getting, or even some document assembly. But wow, use responsibility, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm not so proud as to say I've used it.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I was, I think, just telling you earlier, Ben, that there was a situation. I know that this regulation exists. I know exactly what it says, but I just need the site quick. And I could have gone to Google and typed it in. I had ChatGPT up. So I just typed it in, give me this. It kicked out the site, clicked on the link, did the, same thing more efficiently, I would argue, than Google did, because I didn't have a bunch of optimized responses from law firms that have, written blog posts on it first. And so I think lawyers are in the same position as schools for that matter. You're going to have a large segment of our profession that's going to say, no, I'm not using that stuff. It's going to kill our industry. Man, that is the wrong way to think about it, in my opinion. Yeah. Lawyers, parents, community, we should all be thinking about it as a tool that we can use that may not substitute for a lot of the other stuff that we do, the independent judgment we all have to exercise at some point. But again, to me, it comes back to that embracing, and at a minimum, embracing it enough to understand it so that you can anticipate, but also respond to the implications it has across your other policies and communications and things that you're doing at the school.
For sure. For sure. Well, I love the work that you're doing with schools. As you reference your North Star, thinking about the way that you're helping schools, reducing risk and ultimately building trust. Bobby, appreciate the work you're doing and helping empower content creators. And you've been doing that since you were getting schools onto social media, 2008, 9. So thank you for all the work you're doing.
Yeah, happy to do it. I love this stuff. I'm so thankful for the schools out there doing what they're doing for kids. It's not an easy time to do it right now. There's not enough folks, that are real eager to do that work. But any small part that we can play, happy to do it, and very happy to be here chatting with some of this stuff about you today.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on to the podcast, Bobby, and look forward to seeing you soon.
Sounds great. Thanks, Ben.